The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday Pearl Morgan was stepping off a rattling stagecoach into the red dust of Harlan Creek, Colorado, with a leather satchel full of surveying charts, a ledger the size of a family Bible, and absolutely no patience for the kind of nonsense she suspected was waiting for her here. It was the autumn of 1882, and the federal government had been sending land auditors into the Colorado territories with increasing urgency ever since the railroad companies had begun snaking their iron tracks through mountain passes and river valleys, buying up land at prices that bore no resemblance to the actual assessed value on record. Pearl had been working for the Bureau of Land Management out of Denver for 3 years, and in those 3 years she had untangled disputed claims in 4 counties, caught 2 separate instances of deed forgery, and earned a reputation as the most thorough auditor in the Western Division. She was 27 years old, sharp-eyed, and entirely unwilling to be charmed, bribed, or frightened into producing a report that said anything other than precisely what the facts dictated. Harlan Creek was not what she had expected, though she was not entirely sure what she had expected. The town sat in a broad valley ringed by mountains so tall and so immediate that Pearl felt the whole sky had been compressed down to a narrower thing than she was used to. The peaks were already dusted with early snow, even though the valley itself was still warm, the aspens burning gold along every hillside as if the whole range had been set quietly on fire. Main Street was a single long strip of unpainted timber buildings, a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a small church with a crooked steeple, and an office with a painted sign reading Harlan Creek Land Registry and Surveying. That last building was where she needed to go, but first she needed somewhere to put her bags, and the woman at the stagecoach stop pointed her to a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Ella Croft, 3 buildings down on the left. Mrs. Croft was a small, round woman with white hair pinned so tightly it seemed to pull the corners of her eyes upward, and she looked Pearl over with the calculating attention of someone who had learned to read character quickly from long experience with strangers. She gave Pearl a room on the 2nd floor with a window facing the mountains, a wash basin, a decent iron bed, and a stern warning that supper was served at 6 o'clock sharp and not a minute later. "You're the government woman," Mrs. Croft said. It was not a question. "I am," Pearl confirmed, setting her satchel on the bed and unfastening her coat. "Pearl Morgan, Bureau of Land Management. I expect to be here for 2 or 3 weeks." Mrs. Croft pursed her lips in a way that suggested 2 or 3 weeks might prove optimistic. "You know about the Carver situation?" she asked. Pearl looked up from the clasps on her satchel. "I know there is a dispute involving a significant parcel on the northern valley slope. That is why I am here." "The dispute, Mrs. Croft said, smoothing her apron with both hands as if she were trying to press the word flat, "is between the Dunmore Land Corporation and Hugh Carver. Dunmore's got a lawyer in from Denver and a surveyor they brought themselves, which is already irregular if you ask me. Hugh's been on that land since before this town had a name. His father homesteaded it in '61. Hugh's been working it since he was 14 years old." She paused. "He's not a man who takes well to being told he does not own what he has always owned. I am not here to tell anyone anything," Pearl said carefully. "I am here to examine the deeds and produce an accurate report." Mrs. Croft gave her another long look, then nodded once as if she had decided something. "Supper's at 6, she repeated, and left Pearl alone with the mountains outside her window. The land registry office smelled of old paper, lamp oil, and something faintly medicinal that Pearl could not identify. The registrar was a nervous young man named Clifton Poole who wore spectacles on a chain and had the unfortunate habit of repeating the last few words of any sentence you said to him before answering it. He had been the registrar for 18 months, having taken over when the previous registrar died of a heart complaint, and he was visibly relieved to see Pearl in a way that made her immediately suspect the situation was worse than the Denver office had let on. "What exactly is the nature of the Dunmore claim?" Pearl asked, setting her ledger on the large central table and beginning to arrange her instruments. "Dunmore claim," Clifton repeated, pulling a thick file from a cabinet that looked like it might collapse if you leaned on it too hard. The Dunmore Land Corporation filed an amended claim in August, saying that the original Carver homestead deed from 1861 is irregular because the full northern boundary was never properly surveyed and filed. They're saying a strip of land, roughly 800 acres along the upper ridge, was never legally incorporated into the Carver deed, and that strip happens to be the very parcel the railroad needs to lay track through the mountain pass. Pearl picked up the Dunmore filing and read it carefully, front to back, before she said anything. It was professionally drafted, clearly the work of an experienced attorney, and it was built around a single technical claim. She could see immediately why the Denver office had flagged it for investigation. "And the original Carver deed?" she asked. "Do we have the original?" Clifton looked uncomfortable. "We have a copy," he said. "The original is held by Hugh Carver himself. He has it in a lockbox at his property. The original registered copy that should have been here in this office is missing. It disappeared sometime in the last 6 months." Pearl set down the filing and looked at Clifton with an expression that had made grown men squirm on multiple previous occasions. A registered deed disappeared from a federal land registry office. "Disappeared," Clifton confirmed miserably. "I have looked everywhere. I suspect it was taken, but I cannot prove by whom." Pearl was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and began writing in her ledger. "I am going to need to examine the Carver property myself," she said. "I will need to see his copy of the original deed, walk the boundaries, and assess the terrain of the disputed strip. Can you arrange an introduction?" Clifton looked at her with something between relief and pity. "Hugh Carver doesn't come into town much," he said. "He trades at the general store once a month, maybe. He does not like visitors on his land, particularly not government visitors. He had some trouble with a federal surveyor last spring. The surveyor tried to walk the disputed boundary without permission and Hugh turned him away at gunpoint." Pearl absorbed this. "I see," she said. "I will ride out tomorrow morning." "You ride?" Clifton asked, apparently surprised. "I have ridden since I was 6 years old," Pearl said, and did not elaborate. She arranged a horse from the livery the next morning, a steady bay mare the stable hand called Rosette, and she packed her satchel with the relevant files, her measuring chain, and a lunch Mrs. Croft pressed upon her without being asked. The ride out to the Carver land took the better part of 2 hours, following a road that started as a genuine road and gradually became a trail, and then became something that was more suggestion than trail, winding north through aspen groves that blazed so brilliantly in the morning light that Pearl had to consciously remind herself she was here on professional business. She smelled the wood smoke before she saw the cabin, and then through the thinning aspens she saw the property and stopped Rosette at the edge of the clearing, because the view simply arrested her. The Carver homestead sat on a broad bench above the valley floor, backed against a steep ridge that rose to meet the snowfields above and faced out over the whole sweep of the valley below. The cabin itself was large and solid, built of logs so carefully fitted that it looked like it had grown from the mountain rather than been constructed on it. Behind the main cabin was a barn, a corral, a root cellar, a small building that might have been a smokehouse, and beyond those, terraced fields where something had already been harvested, the golden stubble catching the morning light. The whole place had an air of deep, settled permanence about it, the permanence of a place that had been loved into that condition over decades. And standing in the yard with an axe in his hands, watching her approach with an expression of absolute stillness, was Hugh Carver. Pearl had been told he was a mountain man. She had formed no particular mental image of what that meant, but now that she saw him, she thought the word suited him with an unusual precision. He was very tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came not from any deliberate effort but from a lifetime of physical work, broad through the shoulders and chest in a way that made the yard seem slightly smaller. His arms heavy with muscle beneath rolled shirt sleeves even in the cool autumn air. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar in a way that suggested he cut it himself when it became sufficiently inconvenient, and his jaw was covered in a close-cropped beard. He might have been 32 or 33. He looked at Pearl with dark eyes that gave nothing away. He did not lower the axe. He did not move at all. He simply waited. Pearl rode to within a respectable distance and stopped. "Mr. Carver," she said, "my name is Pearl Morgan. I'm an auditor with the Bureau of Land Management out of Denver. I have been sent to examine the disputed boundary claim on your northern parcel. I would like to speak with you." He continued to look at her without speaking. A moment passed that stretched considerably longer than was comfortable. "I am not Dunmore's surveyor," she said. "I am not here on behalf of the railroad. I am here because the federal government has an interest in producing an accurate record of what belongs to whom, and right now the record is incomplete. I would like to make it complete." He set the axe head down in the dirt and rested both hands on the handle. "The last government man who came here told me he had no interest in anything except the accurate record," he said. His voice was low and measured, and she noted that he chose his words deliberately, like a man who had learned the value of precision from long experience with silence. 2 weeks later, Dunmore's attorney filed an amended claim that used measurements the government man had taken on my land without my permission. "That was wrong," Pearl said. She met his eyes and held them. "I'm going to ask your permission before I measure anything, and I'm going to show you every measurement I take and what I intend to do with it. If you find any of my methods irregular, you may tell me so and I will answer your concern. I give you my word on that." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. It was not quite warmth. It was more like a small door opening a crack. He looked at her satchel, then at her face, and then he stood aside and gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee." The inside of the cabin was nothing like Pearl might have predicted and exactly like the outside had suggested. It was clean and ordered, every tool and piece of equipment in its place. A wood stove with 2 chairs pulled close to it, a heavy table with 4 chairs around it, bookshelves built into the wall that held an actual collection of books, dog-eared and clearly read, not decorative. There was a rag rug on the floor, hand-braided. There were 2 good oil lamps. The window above the sink faced the mountain. He put coffee on the stove without particular ceremony and sat down across from her at the table. He was close enough now that she was more aware of how large he was, the sheer solidity of him, and she found herself adjusting her professional manner slightly without quite being able to say why. She spread her documents on the table between them. "I have the Dunmore filing," she said, "and I have the copy of the original Carver deed from '61. The registrar's copy has gone missing, which I intend to investigate separately. But before I can assess the validity of Dunmore's claim, I need to see the original deed and I need to walk the boundary they are disputing, specifically the strip along the upper ridge." Hugh reached across the table to look at the documents. His hands were a working man's hands, scarred and rough, but he handled the papers with a carefulness that told her he understood their importance. He read through the Dunmore filing slowly and thoroughly, and she could see something harden in his expression as he read, though he did not speak until he reached the end. "This is the third version of this argument," he said finally. "First, they tried to say the original grant was fraudulent. When that didn't hold, they tried to say the boundary markers were in the wrong place. Now this." He set the papers down. "The land on that ridge has been in my family for 21 years. I have cattle up there every summer. There is a spring up there my father found and developed. The boundary is exactly where it has always been." "I believe you," Pearl said, and the simplicity of the way she said it appeared to catch him off guard. "But belief is not what the Bureau requires. Evidence is what the Bureau requires, and right now the evidence is incomplete enough that Dunmore's attorney can argue in front of a federal judge and potentially win. I need to close that gap." He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it. He went to the bookshelf, and from behind the second row of books, he pulled a metal box, the kind used for important documents, and from the box he produced a folded document that he brought to the table and opened with the same careful hands. The original Carver deed was in better condition than she had dared hope. The paper was yellowed and creased from decades of folding, but the writing was clear, the government seal still visible, and most importantly, the attached survey map was intact, showing the boundary lines as they had been drawn in 1861 by a government surveyor named H. Aldcott. Pearl studied it for a long time, making careful notes, comparing measurements against the copy from the Denver file. "The technical argument Dunmore is making," she said slowly, tracing her finger along a line on the original survey, "is that this segment here, the northeastern boundary, was drawn as a straight line between 2 described natural features, but those natural features were never specifically identified in the written description. They are arguing that the straight line could have been drawn from 2 different interpretations of which rock formation and which creek bend the original surveyor intended, and that under their interpretation, 800 acres of ridge land falls outside your deed." Hugh leaned forward to look where she was pointing. He was close enough now that she could smell wood smoke and pine resin and something that was simply him, an outdoor smell, clean and mountain cold. She made herself concentrate on the document. "The spring I mentioned," he said. "My father and old Aldcott used it as a reference point when they set the markers. There are physical markers up there. Stone cairns my father built. They have been there for 21 years. Pearl looked up at him. "If those markers are still standing and their positions match the original survey, that would largely invalidate Dunmore's argument," she said. "The problem is that I have not seen them, and Dunmore's surveyor has filed a counter-description that does not mention them. Because Dunmore's surveyor is either incompetent or dishonest," Hugh said with a bluntness that Pearl found unexpectedly refreshing after 3 weeks of carefully lawyered filings. "That is a possibility I am also considering," she said, which made something flicker in his expression that was not quite a smile but was close enough to one that she noticed it. "I need to walk the ridge. Will you take me up there?" He looked at her for a moment. Outside, a hawk called once and the sound faded into the thin mountain air. "When?" he asked. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds." He looked out the window at the sky, reading it in a way she could tell was entirely automatic, the habit of years. "Weather will hold tomorrow," he said. "We start at first light. It's a hard ride and the last part is on foot. Bring boots you can walk in." "I have been walking difficult terrain in proper boots for 3 years," she said mildly. He looked at her boots, which were in fact entirely serviceable, and gave a small nod. Pearl collected her documents, finished her coffee, which was strong enough to have dissolved a nail, and stood to leave. Hugh walked her outside to her horse and stood by while she mounted, and she was aware of his attention as she rode back down through the aspens, not an uncomfortable attention, but a watchful one, like a man who had learned to monitor everything in his vicinity out of simple practical necessity. She thought about those stone cairns for most of the ride back to town. The next morning Pearl was at the Carver property before the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks, the air cold enough to see her breath, dressed in her warmest riding skirt and her good walking boots. Hugh was already in the yard tacking up a large gray horse, a powerful-looking animal that matched him in scale, and he had packed a set of saddlebags that she suspected held considerably more useful items than her own satchel. He looked at her when she rode up with that same measuring expression she was beginning to find she liked, because it was honest. He was not looking at her the way some men looked at a woman alone on their property, with either contempt or something more troubling. He was looking at her like a man assessing weather, with genuine attention to what he was actually seeing. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," she said. They rode north from the cabin into terrain that grew steeper and wilder with every mile. Hugh moved through it with the ease of a man who has walked the same ground so many times it lives in his body, ducking branches without looking, reading the trail with an ease that Pearl found genuinely impressive. She was a good rider, but this was a different kind of good riding, mountain riding, where the ground could tilt unexpectedly, and the footing was never fully trustworthy, and she concentrated on managing Rosette carefully while also trying to track their direction against the survey map she had folded and tucked into her coat pocket. After an hour and a half, they dismounted and tied the horses at the edge of the tree line, where the aspens gave way to a slope of loose rock and low scrub. Hugh transferred her satchel to his own shoulder without asking, and she did not argue with him because she recognized practical competence when she saw it, and there was no virtue in hauling her own satchel up a loose rock slope when someone far more capable of doing so without breaking his neck was already doing it. The upper ridge was a different world from the valley below. The air was thinner and sharper, the light had a crystalline quality, and the view unrolled in every direction with a staggering generosity, peaks upon peaks in every direction, the valley a narrow golden ribbon far below, the sky above so intensely blue it seemed almost painted. Pearl stopped twice, not because she needed to catch her breath, though she did need to catch her breath, but because the landscape demanded acknowledgement. Hugh noticed her stopping and said nothing, but she caught him watching her reactions with something attentive in his face that she could not immediately categorize. They reached the first cairn 40 minutes after leaving the horses. It was a substantial pile of stones, 3 feet high, clearly not accidental, clearly placed with deliberate care and engineering. Hugh crouched beside it and ran his hand along the stones with a quietness that Pearl found moving, without being able to say precisely why. There was something in the gesture, the way a man touches something that belonged to his father, that spoke of a whole history she was not privy to. "My father stacked these," Hugh said, not looking up. "He and Aldcott spent 3 days on this ridge getting the markers right. He said he wanted to do it once and never have to worry about it again." A pause. "He's been gone 8 years. "I am sorry," Pearl said, and she meant it. He stood and looked out over the valley with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite peace, but something that lived between the two. "He loved this land the way some men love their families," he said. "He said a man who knew his land knew himself." He looked at her sideways. "I suppose that sounds like wilderness philosophy to you, the kind of thing men say to sound profound." "It does not sound that way at all," Pearl said honestly. "It sounds like a man who was good at his life." Hugh was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The second cairn is 200 yards northeast. We need all 4 to make the argument you want to make." They found all 4 cairns. Pearl measured each one's position using her compass and measuring chain, recording every figure with the meticulous care that was her professional signature, and Hugh held the far end of the chain and moved where she directed without complaint or impatience, which was rarer among men than it should have been. He watched her work with what she was beginning to recognize as his natural mode, that steady, attentive quiet that was not vacancy but something closer to its opposite. The measurements were unambiguous. The 4 cairns corresponded exactly to the corner points described in H. Aldcott's original survey. The northeastern boundary, the one Dunmore was disputing, ran along the ridge precisely where it had always run, placing the spring and the 800 acres firmly within the Carver deed. Dunmore's alternative interpretation of the natural feature references would have required the original survey line to run at an angle that was physically impossible given the actual topography of the ridge, a fact that Pearl noted carefully in her ledger. "This is clear," she said, sitting on a flat boulder to complete her notes while the afternoon light turned the mountains around them to copper and rose. "The Dunmore claim does not hold up against physical evidence. Their interpretation of the boundary requires the original survey to have ignored 2 obvious and well-documented natural features in favor of 2 significantly less prominent ones, which no competent surveyor would have done. Aldcott's original notes describe the spring explicitly. The spring is on your land." Hugh stood several yards away, his back to her, looking out at the view. His coat had come open in the afternoon warmth of the upper ridge, and she could see the breadth of his shoulders against the sky, the easy power in his posture, the way he seemed to belong to this particular piece of the world in a way she had not seen a person belong to a landscape before. "You are sure," he said, not turning around. "Professionally certain," she said. "I will put it in my report in terms that a federal judge cannot mistake." He was quiet for a long time, then he said something that surprised her. "Come here," he said. "I want to show you something." She closed her ledger and went to stand beside him, and he pointed northeast to where the ridge line curved out of sight behind a shoulder of rock. "There is a meadow on the other side of that outcrop," he said. "About 2 acres. It is protected from north wind by the rock and faces south, so it gets more sun than anything else up here. In summer, it fills up with Indian paintbrush and columbine. The elk come there to rest in the morning." He paused. "My father used to say that was the heart of the land, the place where the land was most itself. He said every piece of land has a place like that if you take the time to know it." Pearl stood beside him and looked toward the invisible meadow and felt something happen in her chest that she was not going to examine too carefully while standing on a mountain with a man she had known for less than 2 days. She looked instead at the sweep of the valley below, the town of Harlan Creek, a tiny collection of brown rectangles at its center, the silver thread of the creek running through it, the mountains pressing in from every side in their ancient and beautiful indifference. "He was right," she said, "about knowing the land, knowing yourself." She hesitated, which was unusual for her. "I have spent 3 years reading land deeds. I know more about the square mileage and legal descriptions of the Colorado Territory than almost anyone in Denver. But this is the first time I have stood on land that I was supposed to be describing in numbers, and felt that the numbers were completely inadequate." Hugh turned to look at her then. He was close enough that she could see the detail of his face clearly, the weathered skin, the dark eyes that she thought were not so much guarded as simply deep, the kind of depth that comes not from hidden things but from long experience with a place and the slow accumulation of meaning. "That is not an auditor's thought," he said. "No," she agreed. "I suppose it is not." They stood like that for a moment, the afternoon light slanting gold between them, the hawk she had heard yesterday, or one very like it turning on a thermal high above. Then the wind shifted and brought the smell of coming cold off the snowfields above, and Pearl shivered without meaning to. Hugh reached into his saddlebag and produced a heavy wool blanket that he held out to her, with the matter-of-fact practicality of a man who anticipated need before it was stated. She took it and wrapped it around her shoulders, and he turned his attention back to the horizon with the same quiet courtesy that had characterized everything he had done since she arrived, as if giving her space was a thing he understood instinctively. "We should get down before the light goes," he said. They made their way back to the horses, in a silence that Pearl found unusual only in how comfortable it was. She had spent most of her professional life in the company of men who either talked too much in order to impress her, or who froze up in an awkward social difficulty they did not know how to navigate, and the men who had found her attractive had generally expressed it in ways that made professional interactions complicated. Hugh Carver did none of these things. He simply moved through the world with her, as if she were someone he trusted, which was both the simplest thing and the most unusual thing she had experienced in some time. On the ride back down, as the aspens glowed orange in the failing light and the first stars appeared above the eastern peaks, he said, "There is something you should know." "Tell me," she said. "Clifton Poole is a decent man, but he is frightened," Hugh said. "He has been frightened since last spring when 2 of Dunmore's men came to the registry office and stayed for an hour with the door locked. 3 days later, the original registered copy of my deed was gone. He looked straight ahead on the trail. He did not take it. He was pressured into looking the other way. I do not think a man should be destroyed for being frightened." Pearl thought about this carefully. "He has been helpful to me," she said. "And what you are describing is a crime committed by Dunmore's representatives, not by Clifton Poole. My report will reflect that." Hugh nodded once, satisfied. "He has a wife and a baby coming in February," he said. "That is why he was frightened." "I understand that," Pearl said, and she did, and she appreciated that he had told her that he had spent some of the weight of his own grievance on speaking up for a man who had not spoken up for himself. That night at Mrs. Croft's supper table, Pearl ate salt pork and biscuits and thought about stone cairns on a ridge in the last afternoon light, and a man who spoke to her like an equal and knew the heart of his own land. She was here for 2 or 3 weeks. It had been 2 days. The following morning Pearl went back to the registry office and requested every document relating to the Dunmore Corporation's activities in Harlan Creek going back 3 years. What she found in those files was considerably more disturbing than the disputed boundary claim alone. Dunmore had filed amended claims or formal objections against 7 separate landholders in the valley, 4 of them small family homesteads, 2 of them grazing allotments held by families who had been ranching the area since the 1860s, and 1 of them, a water rights claim that affected the entire northern end of the valley. In every case, the legal pressure was accompanied by a version of the same technical argument: an original deed irregularity, a missing description, an ambiguous boundary line. And in 3 of the 7 cases, the original registered copies of the relevant deeds had gone missing from Clifton Poole's files. Pearl sat back from the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she began to write, quickly and steadily, the kind of writing that was not the careful, deliberate documentation of field notes, but the faster, harder writing of a woman building a case. By noon, she had a preliminary outline that went well beyond the original scope of her assignment. What she was looking at was not a single disputed boundary claim. What she was looking at was a systematic campaign by the Dunmore Land Corporation to destabilize land titles across the northern Harlan Creek Valley in advance of the railroad's arrival, using a combination of legal filings, missing documentation, and, she suspected, at least one corrupt party inside the land registry infrastructure. It was the kind of operation that had been tried in other territories, and in several of those territories it had succeeded because the evidence had been allowed to remain scattered and unassembled. She was assembling it. She sent a telegram to the Denver office that afternoon that was longer than any telegram she had previously sent in her professional life, and which ended with a request for a federal marshal to be dispatched to Harlan Creek at the earliest opportunity. Then she went back to work. She did not ride out to the Carver property that day, but she found herself thinking about it, about the particular quality of the silence up on that ridge, and the way Hugh had said the words "my father" with such plain and unguarded weight. She thought about the spring he had mentioned, a spring his father had found and developed, and about the meadow on the other side of the outcrop that filled with columbine in summer. On the 3rd day she rode out again, this time to speak with 2 of the other families whose deeds were under pressure from Dunmore. The first was the Hartwell family, a husband and wife in their 50s who had been on their land for 16 years and who had received a legal notice in September that was so alarming in its implications that Mrs. Hartwell had not slept well since. Pearl spent 2 hours with them, going through their documents, and found that their original deed was in good order, the Dunmore filing against them even weaker than the one against Hugh. She told them so clearly and watched the relief move through them like a wave. The second family was harder to reach, living further up the valley in a cabin that had seen better decades, and when Pearl arrived, she found a woman of 40 or so named Josephine Reyes who spoke English as her second language and who had been dealing with the Dunmore pressure essentially alone, because her husband was working in the silver mines to the west and only came home twice a month. The Reyes deed situation was more complicated. The original grant documentation partially in Spanish from the prior territorial period, and Pearl spent the whole afternoon working through it with Josephine, translating and cross-referencing. until she was satisfied that the grant was valid and that Dunmore's argument against it was built on a deliberate misreading of the original Spanish terminology. She rode back through the golden aspens in the last of the daylight and stopped at the Carver property, because the light on the mountains was doing something extraordinary, the last sun catching the snowfields above and turning them to hammered gold while the valley below fell into blue shadow, and she could not ride past it without stopping. Hugh was on his porch. He had a book in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, and he watched her stop on the trail below the yard without obvious surprise, as if he had half expected her. "Come up," he said. She tied Rosette and came up to the porch and leaned against the railing to look at the mountains the way you had to look at them in this particular light, fully and without reservation. "I have been working on the broader case today," she said. "The other families," Hugh said. "It was not a question." "Dunmore has been methodical," Pearl said. "They have applied the same approach to 7 different properties across the valley: the Hartwells, the Rays family, the Callaway grazing allotment, 3 others. All of them in the path of the proposed rail line." Hugh was quiet for a moment. "I knew some of it," he said. "Tom Hartwell told me last spring that he had received a filing." "I did not know the full scope." "Few people do," Pearl said. "That is how it works. Keep each grievance isolated so the pattern is never visible." She paused, watching a hawk on a thermal above the ridge, the same effortless circling she had noticed on the first day. "I have requested a federal marshal from Denver. My report is going to be considerably larger than what was originally anticipated." Hugh set his book down on the porch railing and turned to look at her directly. The evening light made his face warm, and the dark eyes were steady on her, with an attention that she felt all the way through her professional composure. "You are going to cause considerable trouble for Dunmore," he said. "I am going to cause considerable trouble for Dunmore," she agreed. "They have a lawyer here who does not appear to have any reservations about tactics," Hugh said carefully. Pearl turned to look at him. "Are you warning me to be careful?" "I am saying that men who are accustomed to winning by irregular means do not always accept losing gracefully," he said. There was no drama in how he said it, no attempt to make himself heroic by emphasizing the danger. He said it the way he said everything, as a plain fact that mattered and deserved to be stated clearly. "I appreciate that," she said. "I have dealt with this type before. In 2 previous counties. And you are still here," he observed, with the faintest trace of something that was not quite a smile but was close to admiring. "I am still here," she confirmed. She had supper on the porch with him that evening because it seemed like the natural extension of the conversation, and because Mrs. Croft's 6 o'clock supper had come and gone while she was working through the Rays documents and she had not been back in time for it. Hugh produced bread and cold smoked elk and a dense, sweet tart preserve that he said was chokecherry from the bushes along the south fence line, and they ate in the cooling evening air with the mountains turning purple above them and the first stars coming out directly overhead. She found out in that conversation that he had read more broadly than she had expected, that he subscribed to 2 periodicals through the general store in town, that he was currently in the middle of a history of the Roman Republic that he had ordered from a bookshop in Denver, that he had opinions about the recent land policies coming out of Washington that were both informed and pungent. She found out that he had built the barn himself over 2 winters. She found out that he had a scar along his left forearm from a cougar encounter 3 years ago that he recounted with the flat economy of someone describing an accounting error rather than a near-fatal wildlife incident. She found out that he had never been east of Pueblo. She told him about Denver, which she had come to love in the 3 years she had lived there, about the bureau office with its stacks of territorial maps that covered every flat surface, about the woman she boarded with there, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Abrams, who was teaching herself to paint watercolors and left brushes in unexpected places throughout the house. She told him about her family in St. Louis, her father who was a printer, her mother who taught music, her younger brother Daniel who was studying law. She had not thought about her family this concretely in some time. She realized as she spoke the way professional absorption could distance you from ordinary warmth if you were not careful. Hugh listened to all of it with his full attention, asking precise and intelligent questions when something interested him, and Pearl thought as the evening moved toward genuine night that she could not remember the last time she had had a conversation with a man who listened this way. "You have been here by yourself for 8 years," she said at one point, meaning it as an observation about how he managed the property. He understood what she was actually asking. "Yes," he said. "A few years back there was a woman in town, Clara Davis. She was the school teacher. We kept company for a while. But she had been promised to a man in Kansas City before she came west, and he came to collect on that eventually." He said this without visible bitterness, which Pearl found more telling than bitterness would have been. "This is a particular kind of life," he added. "Not everyone can take to it." "No," Pearl said. "I imagine not." She rode back to town in the dark with the stars burning hard and cold above the aspens, and thought that she was not a woman who made a habit of romanticizing lonely mountain men any more than she made a habit of producing inaccurate land reports. She was a professional. She was here for a specific purpose. She was here for at most 3 more weeks. She thought about the meadow on the other side of the rock outcrop that filled with Indian paintbrush and columbine in summer. The following week was the hardest and most productive of her professional life. She worked 12-hour days in the registry office, building the case against Dunmore piece by careful piece, cross-referencing deeds, comparing survey maps, identifying the specific documents that had been removed, and where their absence had created the legal vulnerabilities Dunmore was exploiting. She found the thread that connected the missing deed copies to a formal records request filed by Dunmore's attorney, a man named Gerald Finch, who had technically been within his rights to examine the originals, but who had clearly taken advantage of Clifton Poole's inexperience and unease to leave the office with more than he had arrived with. On the 5th day of that week, Gerald Finch appeared at the registry office door in a tailored coat and a hat that cost more than Clifton Poole made in a month, and looked at Pearl's organized documentation with an expression she recognized as the particular displeasure of a man who had expected a less thorough opponent. "Miss Morgan," he said, in the tone of a man who used a woman's courtesy title as a subtle diminishment, "I wonder if you might be available to discuss a proposed resolution to the Carver boundary matter." "Mrs." Pearl said, which was a correction rather than a statement of fact but served its purpose effectively. "And I am conducting an official federal investigation, Mr. Finch. Any communications regarding the Dunmore Corporation's land filings should be directed to the Bureau of Land Management in Denver." Finch smiled with his mouth. "Of course. I simply wanted to mention that my client has authorized a very generous settlement proposal for the affected landholders, including the Carver property. It would save everyone considerable time and expense." "Mr. Finch," Pearl said, looking up from her work with the directness she had spent 3 years perfecting, "the landholders whose properties your client has been systematically targeting are not required to settle claims that the evidence does not support. My report will make that clear to the federal judiciary. I would strongly recommend that you consult with your client about the legal exposure they are developing through the means by which these filings were constructed." She held his gaze without expression. "That is the only thing I have to say to you outside of official channels." Finch left. Clifton Poole, who had been standing in the corner with the expression of a rabbit watching a hawk, exhaled slowly. "He is going to come back," Clifton said. "He may," Pearl said. "But I expect the federal marshal will arrive before the end of the week, and after that the conversation will be different." She rode out to the Carver property that evening not because there was specific business remaining, but because the Carver property had become the place she went when she needed to think clearly, or perhaps when she needed to stop thinking clearly in the particular relentless way she thought when she was working. And she suspected without allowing herself to examine the suspicion too closely that it was not only the mountains and the high, clean air that made that possible. Hugh was splitting wood when she arrived, and she paused at the fence to watch because she had never in her life seen a man split wood with quite that combination of efficiency and sheer mechanical power, the axe rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested he could continue at that pace indefinitely. He had his coat off despite the cold, and his shirt was partially unbuttoned at the collar, and Pearl made herself stop watching and announce her presence because she was a professional woman, and she was here because of the land audit. He heard Rosette's hooves and looked up, and the particular way his expression eased when he saw her was a thing she was going to have to think about at some point. "I brought something," she said, dismounting and producing from her satchel a folded document. "This is a certified copy of the original H. Aldcott survey notes that I found in the Denver archive records. I requested them before I came, but they only arrived today. They contain explicit written references to the spring as a boundary marker in Aldcott's own hand. Your deed is completely clear." Hugh came to the fence and took the document and read it standing there with the axe still in his other hand, and she watched the lines of his face gradually shift from the controlled tension she had not realized was constant in him until it began to dissolve. "This ends it?" he asked. "This ends the boundary dispute," Pearl said. "Dunmore may still try to fight on procedural grounds, but with the original survey notes, the physical cairn measurements, and my report, I do not see a federal judge allowing it to proceed." She paused. "The broader investigation into how the deed copies were removed and whether criminal charges are warranted for the Dunmore Corporation will take longer." Hugh looked at the document for another moment, and then he looked at her and said, "Thank you," with a simplicity and directness that landed harder than any elaborate expression of gratitude could have. "It is my job," Pearl said, which was true. "It is more than your job," he said. "You did not have to look at the other families. You did not have to extend the investigation. Your assignment was the Carver boundary dispute." Pearl looked at him steadily. "My assignment is accurate records," she said. "Accurate records require that systematic irregularities be documented wherever they occur." She paused. "Also, the Ray's family has been dealing with Dunmore's pressure entirely alone for 6 months. That is intolerable." Something moved in Hugh's expression that was warm and quiet and directed entirely at her. "Come see the horses," he said. "I have a foal I have been meaning to show you." In the barn, in the smell of hay and warm animal and clean timber, a bay foal not 3 weeks old folded its improbable legs and pushed its soft nose against Pearl's palm, and she laughed, genuinely and without the professional restraint she had been maintaining for days, and the sound of it in the warm quiet of the barn made Hugh turn to look at her with an expression she recognized finally and clearly for what it was. She looked back at him. The foal butted its nose against her hand again. Outside, the evening wind moved through the pines. "Pearl," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name, and the way he said it with the same care he put into everything made her feel the full weight of it. "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to a question he had asked. He crossed the short distance between them in the easy, unhurried way he did everything and took her hands in both of his, her hands that were ink-stained from 3 weeks of documentation and small against his own, and looked at her with those steady dark eyes as if he were reading a survey map, carefully and completely, and with the intention of remembering every detail. "I have been trying to remain sensible," he said. "I have been trying the same thing," Pearl said. "I am not certain either of us has fully succeeded." He touched her face, just his fingertips against her cheek, the rough skin of his hand gentle as something that had learned gentleness deliberately. "You are going back to Denver," he said. It was not an accusation. It was just the fact of it stated plainly. "My assignment is not finished," she said. "And when it is finished," she looked at him for a long moment. The foal had settled in the hay behind her, and the barn was very warm, and the mountains were pressing in from all sides against the darkening sky. "I think that depends on a good many things," she said. He bent his head and kissed her once, gently, with the kind of restraint that spoke not of coldness, but of a man who understood the value of things and did not treat valuable things carelessly. Pearl held onto the lapel of his shirt and kissed him back and thought with the part of her mind that never stopped working that she had not planned for any of this, and that her plan had evidently been incomplete. When they separated, he was smiling, really smiling, the full version of the expression that she had been catching edges of for days, and it changed his face entirely, made it warm and open in a way that was entirely at odds with the forbidding impression he had made standing in his yard with an axe on the first morning. "I have never brought anyone to the meadow," he said. "The meadow your father called the heart of the land," Pearl said. "Yes, I would like to take you there, when the snow clears in May." "The paintbrush comes in late May." Pearl looked at him and understood that he was asking something larger than a question about a meadow. "All right," she said. The federal marshal, a compact and no-nonsense man named Samuel Tate, arrived from Denver on Thursday of the following week and spent 2 days with Pearl going through the documentation she had assembled. He was thorough and experienced, and he read Pearl's report with the focused attention of a man who had been expecting competence and found more of it than anticipated. "This is a significant case," he said, on the second evening of his review. "If Dunmore has been conducting systematic deed interference across multiple counties, which your documents suggest is possible, this could reach all the way back to the Railroad Commission in Denver." "I believe it does," Pearl said. "I have cross-referenced the properties under pressure here with the proposed route maps that the Denver and Rio Grande filed last spring. Every single disputed property in the Harlan Creek Valley sits within 200 yards of the proposed route." Marshal Tate sat back and looked at her. "What do you need from me?" "To begin with," Pearl said, "I need to speak with Gerald Finch under formal conditions, and I need a witness present when I do." The interview with Finch, conducted in the registry office with Marshal Tate present and Pearl's documentation arranged in its entirety on the central table, lasted 3 hours and ended with Finch's formal cautioning, and a notice that the Dunmore Corporation was under federal investigation for deed interference, fraudulent filing, and corruption of official records. Finch departed Harlan Creek the following morning on the earliest available stage and was not replaced. Pearl spent the following week writing the formal reports. There were 7 of them, 1 for each affected landholder, plus the broader investigative report on Dunmore's activities, and she wrote them with the same careful thoroughness she had applied to every piece of documentation over the past 3 weeks. She wrote them at the registry office during the day and sometimes continued at Mrs. Croft's kitchen table in the evenings, and Mrs. Croft brought her tea without being asked, and occasionally sat across from her and knitted in companionable silence, as if she had decided Pearl was worth the company. "You have been out to the Carver property considerable amount," Mrs. Croft observed one evening, without looking up from her knitting. "The Carver case is the central case of the investigation," Pearl said, not looking up from her writing. Mrs. Croft made a sound that contained a great deal without specifically saying any of it. "Hugh came to town twice in that week, which Clifton Poole quietly mentioned was unusual. He came ostensibly to buy supplies, but both times he found Pearl at the registry office, and both times the supply-buying portion of his visit lasted no longer than the conversation with Pearl required. He helped her carry several heavy ledger boxes that needed to be relocated from one storage cabinet to another, and he read 2 of her draft reports at her invitation, and corrected a detail in the description of the ridge terrain that improved her account of the cairn measurements. He brought her smoked elk again, wrapped in cloth, and she thanked him and ate it at the registry office table while she worked, and Clifton Poole pretended to find something absorbing in a filing cabinet while all of this was happening. On the last official day of her assignment, Pearl delivered the completed reports to Marshal Tate for transmission to Denver, filed certified copies with Clifton Poole for the registry, and sent a telegram to the bureau office summarizing the outcome. The response came back within hours. Her investigation had been accepted in full. The Dunmore Corporation's filings against all 7 properties in Harlan Creek would be dismissed by the Federal Registry. A separate formal investigation into Dunmore's broader activities in Colorado was being opened. Pearl was to take 3 weeks of relieved duty before her next assignment. She stood in the street outside the telegraph office with this information for a long moment, the autumn sun on the mountains behind her, the aspens at their very last gold before the leaves would fall and leave the branches bare. She thought about May. She rode out to the Carver property for what she had planned would be a professional farewell, to inform Hugh of the formal outcome and make sure he understood the next steps in the federal process. She had dressed carefully that morning, and she was angry at herself for dressing carefully. And then she stopped being angry about it, and accepted that she had dressed carefully and let that be a piece of information. Hugh was in the field below the barn doing something agricultural that she did not have the vocabulary to precisely name, something involving a fence post and a tool she would have been able to describe but not identify. He saw her coming and straightened up, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the distance, and then she rode up and dismounted and told him the outcome. He stood very still for a moment after she finished speaking. Then he said, "It's done." "It is done," she said. "The land is yours, legally and completely, as it has always been factually. There is nothing Dunmore can do to change that now." Hugh looked out at his land, the fields and the fences and the ridge above and the snowfields high above that, and Pearl watched his face and thought that she was witnessing something private and profound. A man receiving back the thing he had never truly lost but had been threatened with losing, and she was glad beyond the satisfaction of professional completion to have been the instrument of that return. Then he looked at her. "My assignment here is complete," she said, before he could speak. "I have 3 weeks relieved duty from Denver." A pause. "I had thought of writing to my parents in St. Louis. I have not been home in 18 months. Another pause. "I also thought I might stay in Harlan Creek for a little while longer. There is no professional reason for me to stay." Hugh's expression was everything she needed to see. "No professional reason," he agreed. She stayed. The next 3 weeks unfolded with the particular unhurried quality of time that has been given freely rather than measured against obligation. The mountain man's land in early November was a different thing from what she had first ridden into in the amber of October. The aspens now bare and silver-white against the gray sky, the first real snows coming in waves across the high peaks, the valley settling into the quiet domesticity of preparation for winter. Pearl helped where she was useful and watched where watching was the better choice. And she found that the daily rhythms of the Carver property had their own deep satisfaction, the purposefulness of a life built around a specific place and the specific needs of that place. Hugh showed her the land by degrees, the way you show someone a thing you love, not all at once but piece by piece. The spring on the upper ridge where cold water came out of the rock year-round even in the deepest winter. The south-facing meadow where the elk came at dawn. Not the high meadow above the ridge but a lower one she had not seen, golden with dry grass in the November light. He showed her where the creek bent around a granite outcrop and formed a pool that he said froze solid in January, and which the deer and the elk visited with a kind of trustful regularity that spoke to the undisturbed nature of the place. He told her about the land, and she listened and asked questions that were not the questions of an auditor, but the questions of someone learning a language she had not known she needed to know. He took her to the mountain meadow on the 3rd week, the one his father had called the heart of the land, on a morning when the snow was thin on the ground and the sky was clear and luminous, and the ride up was bitterly cold and entirely worth it. The meadow in November was colorless by the standards of May, a white ground and bare rock and the dark shapes of the surrounding pines, but it had the quality of place that certain places have, a gathered stillness, an intensity of its own kind. Pearl stood in the center of it and turned slowly and felt the mountains pressing in on all 4 sides with their ancient impersonal grandeur, and felt that she understood now what Hugh's father had meant about the heart of the land. Hugh was watching her from the edge of the meadow with the expression she had come to love. "In May," she said, "you said there would be columbine. And Indian paintbrush," he said. "And the elk are usually here in the early morning." "I would like to see that," she said. He came to where she stood in the center of the meadow and faced her with the clear, cold sky behind him. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it plainly because I think that is the only honest way to ask it." "Ask it," she said. "I am asking if you would consider staying," he said. "Not the 3 weeks, not relieved duty. I am asking if you would consider making your life here in this valley on this land with me." He said it without apology and without embellishment, the way he said everything that mattered, as a plain statement of a true thing. "I know what I am asking. This is a particular kind of life, and it is not the life you have been living. Denver is not this. I am not the Bureau of Land Management." "No," Pearl said. "You are considerably more interesting than the Bureau of Land Management." "Pearl," he said. "I know what you are asking," she said. "I have been thinking about little else for 2 weeks." She looked at him, this large and quiet and serious man who had built his barn with his own hands, and read the history of the Roman Republic by lamplight, and knew where the elk came to drink in the early morning, and had treated her from the first day as someone whose intelligence and purpose deserved his full respect. "I did not come here expecting this. I came here to read numbers off a measuring chain and write a report." "I know," he said. "And I am not a woman who makes decisions because of sentiment," she said. "I know that too," he said. "So when I tell you that I would very much like to stay," she said, her voice steady, her eyes on his, "you should know that I have thought about it with all the rigor I apply to anything else important. And the answer is yes. I want to be here. I want to learn this land. I want to be with you." He held her face in both hands and kissed her in the November meadow with the mountains white around them and the cold, clean air moving through the pines. And Pearl felt something settle in her chest with the finality of a properly placed survey marker, the feeling of a correct measurement, the feeling of a thing in its exactly right position. She wrote to Denver that week requesting a transfer of her bureau office base to the Harlan Creek area, citing the ongoing investigation work in the territory as professional justification. The Bureau's response, when it came, was favorable. The territory was expanding and experienced auditors in the field were needed. She could operate from Harlan Creek with monthly reporting trips to Denver. She wrote to her mother and father in St. Louis a letter that took her 3 drafts to complete, not because she did not know what she wanted to say, but because she found that what she wanted to say was larger and more complicated than her usual correspondence. She told them about the land and the mountains, and the audit that had grown into something she had not anticipated. She told them about Hugh in terms that were, she admitted to herself, insufficiently professional for a supposedly professional description. Her mother wrote back within 2 weeks with a letter that contained the words "finally" and "sensible," and "I knew it when you left Denver without your winter coat," and was otherwise extremely graceful about the whole situation. They were married in the spring, in the small church in Harlan Creek with the crooked steeple, on a morning in early April when the first green was just appearing on the valley floor, and the creek was running high with snowmelt. Mrs. Croft baked a wedding cake that was more impressive than the building it came from. Clifton Poole stood beside the groom with a proud and slightly damp expression. The Hartwell family came, and Josephine Reyes came with her husband who was home from the mines for the occasion, and 3 other families from the valley whose land Pearl had helped to defend came as well, filling the little church to a capacity it was not entirely designed for. Pearl wore her good dress, blue wool, and carried a handful of the last late crocuses from the Carver property, which were the only flowers in bloom that early in the season, and she thought she looked entirely competent and professional, and like a woman who had made a fully considered decision. Hugh stood at the front of the church in a coat that was clearly new and almost certainly uncomfortable, his dark hair brushed back. His expression as he watched her come down the aisle one of such complete and unguarded happiness that Pearl felt tears come to her eyes for the first time since she had arrived in Harlan Creek, and considered that entirely appropriate given the occasion. The minister pronounced them Hugh and Pearl Carver, and the whole church, which had been perfectly quiet during the vows, erupted into a warmth of sound that seemed to fill the crooked little building past its capacity. That spring was an extraordinary one on the Carver land. Pearl learned to recognize the plants that Hugh could name without thinking, the early wildflowers and the grass varieties, and the small persistent ground cover that held the soil on the steeper slopes. She learned the cattle by individual temperament, which made Hugh laugh the first time she demonstrated it, a full, rich laugh that she decided immediately she would spend the rest of her life endeavoring to produce. She continued her bureau work, riding out to neighboring valleys and returning to the familiar rhythms of deed examination and survey comparison. But now those rides went out from a home and came back to one, which was different in every way that mattered. In May, precisely when he had promised, Hugh took her to the high meadow in the early morning when the Indian paintbrush was in the first flush of its color, and the columbine stood in clusters against the rock walls, and the elk were at the meadow's edge in the low morning light, 3 of them, unhurried and beautiful and entirely at home. Pearl stood in the center of the meadow and turned slowly, the same way she had turned in November, and the meadow was entirely transformed and entirely the same, the mountains still pressing in from all sides, the sky still that particular luminous blue, but now the ground was a wash of red and purple and gold, and the air smelled of something sweet and wild and entirely alive. She reached for Hugh's hand without looking, and he took it without speaking, and they stood in the heart of the land in the May morning, while the elk moved at the meadow's edge, and the paintbrush burned against the rock, and Pearl Morgan Carver thought about numbers and borders and the precise measurement of things, and thought that the most important things had never been measurable at all. The federal investigation into the Dunmore Corporation concluded that summer, with the result that Pearl had expected and worked toward. Gerald Finch was formally charged with corruption of official records and fraudulent filing, charges to which he ultimately pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. The Dunmore Corporation's land claims against all 7 Harlan Creek properties were officially dismissed. The railroad eventually came to the valley, as it was always going to, but it came on negotiated terms and at fair prices, and the families whose land it required were compensated in the way that the law, when properly enforced, required them to be. Clifton Poole kept his position as registrar and proved, in the years that followed, to be considerably more effective at it once the fear had been removed from the equation. His wife delivered their child in February, a healthy boy they named Thomas. Clifton brought the baby to the Carver property in March to show Pearl and Hugh, and the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, passing the baby between them, while the last of the winter snow came down outside, and it was one of those entirely ordinary and entirely irreplaceable domestic moments that Pearl added to her private collection of the best things. By the end of the summer, Pearl knew she was expecting a child of her own, a fact she informed Hugh of on a Sunday morning in September while they were sitting on the porch with coffee in the early light. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for, the stillness that preceded his deepest responses, and then the expression, and then his arms around her with the careful, immense strength of a man who had just been given the most important thing he had ever been given. Their son was born in April of 1884, a spring birth like their marriage, which Pearl considered entirely appropriate. They named him Aldcott James Carver, the first name for the government surveyor who had placed the boundary markers correctly in 1861, and without whose careful work the Dunmore claim might have succeeded. The second name for Hugh's father, James Carver, who had built stone cairns on a ridge and developed the spring, and loved the land the way some men love their families. Aldcott came into the world with his father's dark hair and his mother's thoughtful eyes, and he grew up between the ledger books and the hay barn, equally comfortable with a measuring chain and a saddle, with his mother's capacity for precise observation, and his father's deep and quiet knowledge of the land he had been born onto. Pearl continued her bureau work through the years that followed, becoming the most senior land auditor in the western Colorado district, known throughout the territory for a thoroughness and integrity that had never once been successfully challenged. She trained 2 younger auditors in the years when Aldcott was small, a young woman from Boulder and a young man from Pueblo, both of whom went on to careers that Pearl tracked with professional satisfaction. She solved 3 subsequent deed fraud cases, 2 of them larger in scope than the Dunmore situation, and her name appeared in federal land case records as a precedent for the standard of documentation required to establish boundary validity in disputed mountain claims. In the autumn of 1886, their daughter arrived, dark-eyed and loud from her first breath, a girl they called Eliza for no particular reason except that it suited her immediately. And Aldcott, at 2.5, approached his new sister with the cautious scientific interest of a small person encountering a significant new phenomenon, which Pearl found very satisfying from a temperament standpoint. The high meadow became a family place. Every May, when the paintbrush came in and the columbine opened against the rock walls, Hugh took Pearl and then later the children up the mountain in the early morning to sit at the edge of the meadow and watch the elk move through the long grass in the first light. Aldcott came to love it with the bone-deep instinctive love of someone who has been shown a beautiful thing repeatedly at the most receptive time of his life. Eliza loved it with a louder and more immediate love, cataloging every flower by color and arguing firmly about what each elk was thinking, which was a slightly different kind of love but equally genuine. Mrs. Croft died in the winter of 1887, peacefully and apparently without suffering, and left her boarding house and its contents to Pearl with a note that said only, "You are the kind of woman this town needed, and I knew it the first day." Pearl read this note twice and then folded it and kept it in the metal box where she stored the most important documents she owned. The Carver property expanded in the following years, carefully and incrementally. 2 additional parcels purchased when neighbors were ready to sell, the barn rebuilt on a larger scale, a second corral added, the fields extended to cover the lower bench above the valley floor. Hugh and Pearl made every significant decision about the land together, Pearl with her surveyor's eye for what was viable, and Hugh with his 20 years of knowing exactly what the land could sustain, and between the 2 of them they made very few mistakes. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, in April of 1892, they sat on the porch in the spring darkness with the mountains black and enormous above the valley, and the stars out in their full winter-clear intensity, even though it was technically spring, and the children were asleep inside, and the foal from the spring barn visit long ago was now herself a mare whose own foal was in the barn below. And Pearl held her coffee cup in both hands and thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in the red autumn dust of Harlan Creek, with a leather satchel full of survey charts and no patience for nonsense, and how much that woman would have failed to anticipate about the decade that followed. "What are you thinking about?" Hugh asked, not looking at her, looking at the mountains the way he always looked at them, with the comprehensive, unhurried attention of a man reading something he had read many times and found new in each reading. "Numbers," Pearl said, "and how inadequate they are." He looked at her then, and she could see his expression even in the dark because she knew it as well as she knew any boundary line she had ever surveyed, its contours and its meaning fully mapped after 10 years of careful and loving attention. "You said something like that the first time I brought you up the ridge," he said. "I meant it then," Pearl said. "I mean it more now." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken her hand in the high meadow on the May morning with the paintbrush burning around them, simply and without ceremony, because it was the thing that was true. The mountains rose above them in the dark, enormous and indifferent and unutterably beautiful. The same mountains that had been there before either of them was born and would be there long after. The mountains that held in their rock and their snowfields and their hidden meadows the spring water and the elk paths, and the stone cairns of men who had loved this land and tried to know it honestly. And Pearl held her husband's hand in the spring darkness and thought that to know a place honestly was one of the finest things a person could do, and that to know a person honestly was finer still, and that she had come here to audit the land and found instead that the land had been quietly auditing her all along, measuring what she was made of in the cold, thin air of the upper ridge, finding her adequate and then more than adequate, finding her finally home. Inside the cabin, Aldcott turned in his sleep and Eliza made a small sound and then was quiet, and the creek below the south fence ran with the seasoned snowmelt, cold and purposeful and entirely sure of where it was going. The stars turned above the mountains. The spring air came down off the snowfields with its particular clean bite. Pearl and Hugh Carver sat on their porch in the good darkness of a life well made, and the mountains kept their ancient patient watch over everything that belonged to them, which was, in the end, everything.